I think it's important to recognize, and I think everyone can fall victim to this in different areas of life, but when you get an answer that doesn't make sense to you, that is not your fault. To the extent there is fault, it's the person who's trying to communicate to you is not meeting your needs in terms of how they are communicating that piece of information. And that ambiguous communication might be an intentional strategy on the part of the salesperson.
Welcome to the Money Skills for Therapists podcast, where we answer this question: how can therapists and health practitioners go from money shame and confusion to feeling calm and confident about their finances and get money really working for them in both their private practice and their lives? I'm your host, Linzy Bonham, therapist turned money coach and creator of the course Money Skills for Therapists. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am excited to have Dave Frank back on the podcast. We are digging into a topic that is so relevant to so many of the students that go through Money Skills for Therapists, and I know folks listening to this podcast, which is balancing debt repayment. How do you figure out how much to focus on paying down debt? How do you balance that with your life and the needs in your life? We talked today about separating out those emotional components, the shaming that can happen around debt, the big voices in the financial space that make debt a shameful thing, and how that impacts our relationship to debt versus the actual cost of debt, which is the literal interest cost, understanding those two things when it comes to your debt. We talk about the difference between simple interest and compound interest. So we get a little technical today. Dave gives a great, really straightforward explanation of the difference between those two things and understanding what kind of debt that you have and how that debt is going to be acting over time. That can help you understand how to prioritize paying down debt, and generally exploring this idea that these things are often simpler than we think that they are. And if there is complexity, if you're being given complexity by a financial coach or professional, if they're making something seem very confusing and opaque that you just need to, trust them, if you get any kind of confused vibes and something feels unclear, you should actually take that as good information. That's a good red flag, especially being the communication professionals that many folks who listen to this podcast are. So lots and lots of ground covered today. Here is my conversation with Dave Frank. So David, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much. I'm excited to be here.
I am excited to have you here. A conversation that we're planning to start to dig into today, one of the things we've talking about is a topic that, on reflection, I've actually covered many times in coaching conversations on this podcast, which is about debt pay down. And something that I see in my students sometimes, folks who are in Money Skills for Therapists, is it can be very stressful having debt, right?
Yeah.
And it can kind of hang over your head, especially types of debt that are like student debt or consumer debt. Like mortgages, we seem to mess with. A mortgage is an inevitable part of being a grown-up. In fact, we see a mortgage as a symbol of success and adulthood. It's like, hey,
interesting.
$500,000 loan, high five, you're a grown-up. But when we have other types of debt like that, like I mentioned, the student loan, I notice has a lot of charge. Definitely the consumer debt, like any credit card debt or like line of credit, can have a lot of weight for people. And then there can be a lot of urgency around the desire to pay it down or pay it down faster than the schedule. And so I wanted to dig in with you, being someone who helps therapists with the personal finance side of things, on your thoughts of how do you balance this? How do you balance paying down debt and like knowing what is strategic versus having money to live life, like holding both of these things at the same time?
Yeah, it's such a great topic. And just as you were sort of teeing up this conversation, what came to my mind is that I think sometimes what can happen is that earlier in our lives, we are perhaps a little bit less focused on some of our personal finances. And so maybe we accrue some debt and we develop some, I don't even like the word bad habits, but we just we learn some lessons and we do some things. So we're kind of almost at one end of the behavioral spectrum, if you will. And then all of a sudden we realize, wait a minute, something's not working here for me. And so now I'm going to fix it. And I'm going to fix all the things overnight. And we quickly go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, and we can, if we start to dive into the world of personal finance online and some of the bigger voices out there, they really do like demonize debt and make it seem like it is the worst thing in the world. And so, especially consumer debt and student loan debt, they can be like very triggering. And there's a lot of shaming sort of around having debt as well. And so I think that can be a different type of danger. Like racking up a bunch of debt without really thinking of it is a bit dangerous. But equally, paying debt down really aggressively and quickly without being thoughtful about it is, I would argue, equally dangerous, just sort of in a slightly different way. And so I think, as with most, if not all things in life, the trick is to find the balance, is to find the middle ground or the middle path. And so that's in general how I try to coach people.
Yeah. And I love your point there, because this is something that certainly in my work with finances over the last few years, I've started to really pull apart with students when they have charge around debt. Is there's two different pieces here. One is the narrative around the debt. And as you say, there's a lot of narratives around debt out there now that are very shaming. Like it's a moral issue to have debt. And I think some of the larger voices in the financial space can be rather conservative voices, Christian conservative, like there is a real kind of like intense morality infused into it, even if it's not named, it's there, right? That it is bad.
Yeah.
You are bad. You are not in control is kind of the messaging in that. So that creates an emotional weight to the debt. And that's part of it.
Totally.
But then the other part is the actual cost of debt. Right. Which is, as you mentioned earlier in life, when you don't have so much money, when I look back on some years in my 20s, I'm amazed I got through. I'm like, how did I live on $11,000?
Amen. Right.
I'm not sure. I think it was probably because my parents bought me dinner sometimes and bought me a winter coat, like that, like truly is what got me through. And so it is very normal that in our earlier years, we tend to earn less. That's just normal for all career paths, and accumulate more debt and not necessarily think about our future. And then you can end up with these debts, right? Large student loans too. Like I think the way the student loan industry works, if we could call it that, where they're just like, hey,
I think we can.
Here's $100,000. You're like, what? Amazing. The free money feeling that can come with that can leave us with a lot of debt.
Yeah.
And debt comes with a literal cost. Like it just literally costs you money to have debt. And that's kind of the other side of, when you're talking about the danger of the debt, that's what I would see as the danger. Is that what you're referring to? Is just like it costs interest to have debt?
Yeah. It's just an expense. There's it costs interest. So the distinction I make is just sort of exactly what you said, is that when we come to financial matters, there are two sides or two pieces of it. Part of the work is internal work, sort of like our emotional reaction, the stories that we're telling ourselves about our behavior and our future and all that. And then there's the external work of what actually are the accounts and the amounts and the dollars and interest and all of that stuff. And the external part also includes what is the right approach and path for you. So that's really what a financial plan is. I mean, I'm a financial planner. I put together financial plans for folks. And that's really just a holistic approach that looks at all of the elements of your life and says, okay, given what you want to do in life, what's important to you, how you're working, your family status, the reality of what your today looks like, including how much debt you have, what is the best way to move forward? We can't change the past, but we can change how we move forward. So I think that's just sort of like the framing. It's just like, let's work to sort of forgive ourselves for our past mistakes, because guess what? Anytime you're dealing with a new area of life in any capacity, we make mistakes because it's new for us. So why would money and borrowing money be any different? Like, of course it wouldn't. Yeah. So what I always say is like, hey, when I talk to a lot of my clients, they're therapists, right? Most of them have their own therapist. So stuff will come up as we're working through it. And we'll talk about it a little bit, and I'll be like, great. So we've identified some amazing things for you to go out and talk to with your therapist about. So what we're going to work on is the external piece. And I'm always happy to have an internal conversation, but I want to be clear that I'm not the person for that, right? Yes. Like I'm not a mental health professional, and it will be our work together. Our external financial work will be much more powerful if you are also doing some of the internal work with your therapist, or maybe you even want to find a specific financial therapist, which is something that's out there. Yes. But let's think about this thoughtfully. So let's just look at the debt and figure out what actually makes sense to do.
Yeah, that holistic view. Because I think what can happen with debt, and if I think about some of these coaching conversations that I've had with folks before, there's two that come to mind. I'll just mention for folks who are listening to the podcast. There was a coaching conversation I had with Jeanette Dove, another one with Aaron Davis, a couple previous episodes, where we dug into this question of, holistically, what does the debt mean in your life, right? And what is the importance of paying down the credit card super fast compared to having a bit of an emergency fund at home, or your kids being able to play hockey this season or not, right? Because something that I think about too as a parent, and I know lots of folks who listen to this podcast are also parents, is it is this very specific season of life, this chapter
Mm.
that is actually over fairly quickly. There's actually only
Yeah,
really like
that's a
a
good point.
kind of like a 15-18 year period where your kids are like with you and they need everything and you're like helping to shape their
Yeah.
growing up, their childhood years. And then that chapter of your life is over and you're still a parent, but you now have adult children who are off doing their own thing. And
Yeah. Totally different.
money gets easier at that point. But when you're in those years, it can feel impossible to balance, the
Yeah.
the field trip with the rep hockey out of town tournament with the credit card that, is going the wrong way. It's getting bigger, not
Hmm.
smaller. It can feel like this impossible
Yeah.
bind for folks. And when you do have that intense
Yeah.
charge around debt of like, I'm failing because I have this debt, right? This says bad things about me. I think it
Right.
can make it become more of a priority than maybe it ought to be for many folks when they think about what actually matters to them.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me just share sort of like the approach that I kind of walk
Yeah,
through
please.
with debt for people. So, again, I work with therapists. So, big surprise, most folks show up with debt, especially student loan
Yeah.
debt. So there's lots of different sort of flavors of debt, I guess I would say, but I'll put them in three kind of general buckets. There's a mortgage, which most folks have. If you're a homeowner, you probably have a mortgage. Then there's student loan debt, which, yeah, that's that. And then there's what I call consumer or revolving debt. So that would be, credit card debt principally, but it could be, also maybe a home equity line of credit or something that you had to draw on. So I kind of say, in general, the mortgage, I kind of set it to the side and I'm just like, it is probably just okay. We're not going to focus a lot on paying this down. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We will focus on paying it down, but just in accordance with what's called an amortization schedule, which is it's just a fancy table that determines what you pay on a monthly basis. And you're sort of every month making a flat payment. Part of that payment is going to pay down the principal, what you borrowed. The other part of the payment is going to pay the bank for lending you money. That's paying interest. So usually we just set that aside and say, like, we don't really need to worry about that. And in fact, in most cases, paying down your mortgage more quickly than that amortization schedule dictates, which is typically 30 years, is usually probably not the smartest financial move. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. But so, like, let's set that aside. The only time it really makes sense to look at a mortgage is, sometimes we just find there is what I might call sort of a structural issue in a financial plan or in your financial life where your income just can't support the mortgage that you've got. And like, that's not a fun conversation or spot to be in. But if you find yourself just doing a lot of work around your budget and debt pay down, and you just can't seem to stop racking up debt, probably there's either a structural financial issue, so that's an external issue, and or there is an internal financial issue that's kind of sabotaging you. So that's a time to do a little bit more work. I think sometimes in that situation, there's a desire to find a magic bullet solution. It's like, I just have to find the right product or the right strategy to solve this problem, when in fact, it's just a simple problem, not simple to solve, not comfortable to confront necessarily, but it's a more basic problem. You don't need to find a fancy strategy to solve it.
Yeah.
So I kind of went off on a tangent, but like, mortgage debt, generally not so bad. Student loan debt, equally generally not so bad. There's a lot of alternatives and complex alternatives to deal with student loan debt. For student loan debt, it's just like, I just want folks to be looking at it and let's think about it. And then there's the last piece, that consumer revolving debt or credit card debt. And that is certainly the most expensive form of debt, by which I mean the interest rate is going to be the highest. So that means it's expensive to have. That high interest rate makes it even more difficult to pay off. So I think if there is consumer or revolving debt with higher interest rates, that's what I like to focus on first. Those other categories, student loans, mortgages, let's just pay those in accordance with the terms that the lender has given us. Let's focus on the consumer debt or credit card debt. And then let's be balanced about it, because debt, as you said, Lindsay, there's moral judgments around it. But at the end of the day, debt isn't good or bad. It's just a tool. It's an available tool out there. And there are some circumstances in which it makes a lot of sense and can be very helpful. And I am a huge fan of sort of, when you're working to pay down that type of debt, to split your goals. Yes, be paying down on the credit card debt. And yes, also be building up an emergency fund. Because if you're paying down debt as aggressively as you can and not putting any money towards an emergency fund, well, guess what? Something's just going to happen again, and you're going to end back in debt like that. I've seen that happen so many times.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily bad. It's just sort of what's happening. You're kind of learning. But I think building up liquidity,
Yeah,
and by with that, I mean kind of having an emergency fund, is important for everyone. It's particularly important for those of us that are self-employed, and any therapist in private practice, whether you're a group practice owner or a solo practitioner. You're a small business person, like you're in business for yourself, and having personal liquidity funds in addition to potentially business emergency funds really can make a big difference and help reduce stress overall.
absolutely. And what I see the biggest cost for folks who are doing the aggressive debt pay down and then end up needing to put money back on debt because their stove breaks or their car needs to be repaired
Right.
is that it's
Right.
demoralizing. It's just so
Yeah. Yeah.
defeating when you've been working so hard and you've been sacrificing so much. You're like, not going out for that coffee and you're not buying the groceries you really want to try to hit this goal. And then you see
Yeah.
yourself get knocked back a few pegs. Like that, I think, is really the cost of it, is when we become so stubborn or single-minded about something and we make it, I would argue, more important than it really ought to be in the context, in the
Yeah.
holistic view of our
Yeah.
life, that it sucks to be defeated. you know,
Absolutely it
and
does.
then you're
Yeah.
like, are you going to go back to being as tight again? Like, do you get back on the horse and keep being like, this is the most important thing in my life. This is my top priority, paying down this debt. Yeah. So that's what I really
Yeah.
see is
Yeah.
that. And then eventually I think folks, you end up just kind of giving up when you go all or nothing. Eventually you
Yeah.
go with nothing and
Totally.
you're like, apparently I just can't pay down this debt. Where that middle road, and I think this is where you and I vibe in a lot of ways, is we're both kind of, I think, balanced middle road people, allows you to still see yourself making progress. But as you said, you're building this financial stability in this other way, which means that if your stove breaks, you'll still end up spending money to buy a new stove, but you won't see your debt going up again, right? In some
Right.
ways, the cash
Yep.
is the same. The numbers might be the same, but the
That's a
emotional
good point.
experience of them is
Yeah.
very different
Yeah.
when you don't feel like you've just lost, been defeated, failed again, right? Which I think
Yep.
is the narrative that comes up for folks.
Yeah. And as you mentioned that is just it's just such a human experience, right? Of trying something new and it failing and it being difficult and getting discouraged and then going back to your quote unquote old ways and then feeling bad about that. I think one of the most important tools or powerful interventions that folks can employ for themselves is just bringing someone else into this relationship between you and money. Whether that's, there's some good financial planners and advisors who do some work like this, although not all of them. There's also a lot of financial sort of coaches out there. Just bringing someone that you can trust, and that is a little bit of a trick, is finding someone that you can trust. But someone that bringing someone else in this conversation so you can be just like, help me stay on track here. Help me figure out when. I mean, I say to clients all the time, you inevitably hit road bumps here. That's just the nature of the work. It's the nature of life, right? It's just like you will just get discouraged. It's almost like kind of like the stages of change, or what is it? I think like traditionally that like didn't have a stage for relapse, but I think that typically relapse
Yes.
sort of like just, kind of backtracking a little
Yes.
bit is just part of it.
Yes.
And it's not that you're broken or that you're somehow wrong or incapable. You're just going through that particular stage of change. And it's just like, oh, okay,
Yeah,
what can I learn here? Like, what am I
exactly.
learning about what's happening?
Yeah, and I've seen versions of the stages of change. I'm thinking about, some handout that I saw 10 years ago where it's not relapse, it's recycle, where you're recycling old behaviors, which is
Ooh,
extra
yes.
therapist-y.
Yes.
Let's take out
I
all the
really
weight.
like that.
You're just recycling old behaviors.
Yeah,
You're going back to what you know best. And I think that's so true. When you can
totally.
recognize that that's actually part of the process,
Yes.
then you can make peace with
Yes.
that too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And get
Yeah.
back to what you were, the bigger goal in mind. And as we're talking about debt pay down, something else that I think is helpful for us to think about and talk about is simple interest, compound interest. Like when you're paying down debt, does it make sense to still put money into your investments? What is your thinking on that?
Yeah.
Because I've noticed myself, like I've taken on a debt related to a backyard cottage that we built. Construction
Mhm.
is its own special
Yeah.
beast when it comes to cost overages,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so
My
we built
gosh.
this
Yeah.
backyard cottage a couple years ago. It was supposed to cost 200,000. It cost us 265,000. Obviously, that 65,000 had to come from somewhere. So we had a HELOC. And I remember when we went to sign our first HELOC, the mortgage, I should say, the woman at the bank, who is some sort of bank professional, partially sales, let me tell you, she was like, well, yeah,
For
you can
sure.
have this HELOC, but also, here's this extra line of credit for 30,000. And I was like, no way, we're not doing this. But my partner was like, oh, you never know, like we might need it. And we did need it because our project went
Yeah.
$65,000 over. So I have this
Yeah.
HELOC that is not insignificant. It has no emotional weight for me, but I have a plan to pay it down.
Right.
But something that I've
Yeah.
decided to do is to simultaneously still put money into our investments. So I'm walking
Yep.
this middle road again, this
Yep.
both and.
Yeah.
And part of my rationale around that is because of simple interest versus compound interest. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on balancing not just debt pay down with life, but debt pay down with saving for your future, like retirement savings. How do you think
Yeah.
about these two things side by side?
Yeah. It's a great question. Maybe I'll just start with sort of a hopefully understandable explanation of the difference between simple interest and compound interest. So simple interest, perhaps ironically named, I'm not sure how simple it is, but like it basically says the interest is only accruing on the principal.
Mhm.
So let me explain what that means. So let's say we make an investment of $100 into the stock market. That $100 is the principal. So then let's say you earn 10% interest on that investment in the first year. So 10% of 100 is 10. So your principal was 100. The first year's worth of interest growth that you've experienced is the $10. So that's 10% of that original principal. So if we were living in a simple interest world, in the subsequent year, you would earn just another $10 in interest because you're earning interest on that original principal or the original investment. So year one, 10%, $10. Year two, 10%, $10. That's simple interest because it's just looking at the principal and it's ignoring the interest that's building up over time. In contrast, compound interest means that something is compounding, it's multiplying, it's becoming sort of geometric in growth. And what that means is that you are not only earning interest on that principal, but you are also earning interest on the past interest that you have gained. So in this simple $100 investment example, in year one, we get 10% of the initial principal because we're just getting started. So that's $10. At the end of year one, we have $110 now sitting in that account. Over the course of year two, yes, we are earning that 10% on the initial principal of $100, and we are earning interest on the $10 of interest we earned in the previous year. And so that just continues to happen. All the interest that you've earned in subsequent years, in future years, is also earning interest.
Yes.
And that's what's compounding. That's compound interest. And that's what can be so powerful and really counterintuitive about long-term investing. You can't believe how quickly compound interest will build up, but it takes quite a few years for that to really kick into gear, for the power of compound interest to really show up.
It's kind of like a
And
snowball, right? Like it starts
exactly like a
small,
snowball.
but the bigger that it is, the more that it
Exactly.
accumulates and it just gets bigger and bigger and
Yep.
bigger and bigger. But yeah, it's a slow rolling snowball to
Yeah.
start. It's not always obvious at the beginning just how powerful that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's one of the reasons why it does compound interest. I mean, it's typically one of the reasons why we say that starting to invest for your long-term goals like retirement is earlier is always better
Yes.
because it gives you more time for that compound interest to really start working. And so that is one of the reasons why I think it does make sense in most cases to balance things between paying down debt and building up retirement savings. The one caveat that I give to that is that retirement accounts or retirement plans that you can put money into are great and they have a lot of advantages. One of the disadvantages is that it is typically pretty difficult to get your money back out.
Yes.
So putting a lot of money into a retirement plan or any other spot where it is very difficult and or costly to get your investment back out when you have a lot of expenses like younger kids or kids in college, when you've got a lot of debt that you need to be taking care of. It's not that you shouldn't be putting no money into those types of investments. It's that you do need to be very cautious and mindful.
Yes. Yeah. And I know in Canada, we have the TFSAs, tax-free savings accounts, and
Okay.
RRSPs. And RRSPs are the ones that are locked, where it's like, you can't take that out
Okay.
unless you're retiring or you're like a first-time home buyer. I think those are really the only
Right.
exceptions. Whereas a
Yep.
TFSA, has different tax benefits. You don't have to pay taxes on the money you earn in that investment, but you can also take it out. There's a lot more flexibility there. And what I generally hear Canadian financial advisors advising people is start with your TFSAs first anyways, like max those out first, unless you're really earning at
that
a
makes
really
sense.
high income bracket, which is not most
Right.
folks listening to this podcast. That's usually not a problem therapists have where we're like, oh, but I make $300,000 a year. There are some for sure, but that's
Yeah,
not most of us.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But so starting with those TFSAs first is usually the most strategic. And also you do have that flexibility because what I'm hearing is like, don't lock that money up too tightly if you're going to need it.
Right.
And if you do put it
Exactly.
into,
Yeah.
a 401k would be my understanding would be an equivalent. It's
That's right.
not so
Yeah.
easy to get it back out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm, not familiar with the different structures available in
Yeah,
Canada, but it sounds a little bit
it's
like the
similar.
TFSA
Yes,
is similar to like
it
a
is.
Roth
It
retirement
is. That would be
account.
the equivalent.
And
Yeah.
yeah, the other one would be a traditional
Yes.
retirement account. Although the TFSA sounds like it's a little bit more flexible than a Roth account.
Yes.
So the Roth is reasonably flexible. Like you can get your contributions back out,
Mhm.
but you can't take your earnings
Mhm.
until later in life.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think the TFSA is more flexible, but similar, I think these things are analogous
Yeah.
enough
Conceptually.
that,
Yeah, for sure.
starting with that more flexible investment is the place to start. Again, because of that compounding. And what I noticed for myself too, emotionally, if we want to talk about the emotional stories with debt, is the nice thing about paying down the debt in a sustainable way, like paying down this HELOC sustainably and saving for retirement, is I get to see myself saving for retirement. I
That's
could
right.
be like,
That's right.
this HELOC is the most important thing in my life. And we're not going on vacation and we're not saving for retirement
Right.
until it's gone. Like if I had a more shame-based narrative around it, I could make it really painful. Like that HELOC could hang over my head every
Absolutely.
day and every night. But it just doesn't because I've run the numbers on how long it's going to take to pay it off. I have a monthly payment we
Yep.
make that's very sustainable. And I'm seeing
Yep.
my partner and I saving for retirement. And I'm, running the rule of 72 in my head, which helps you understand how long it's going to take your money to double. And so I'm thinking about, okay, this 750 that I put away a month is going to double in 10 years. And that's a much better use of my money than, paying down
Right.
this other debt as fast as I can. Right. I think it's taken me a minute to get there, but I do
Yeah,
find it gives me
for
enormous
sure.
peace to be able to hold both of these things simultaneously.
Yeah. Well said. I mean, yeah. And I want to touch back to something just regarding compound and simple interest. So the way we were talking about compound interest is in the area of investing or savings. The other area where interest rates show up or interest shows up is on the debt side when you're borrowing. The idea of compound interest isn't so much a thing in debt. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you take the mortgage interest, just like the most kind of basic debt that we're perhaps more familiar with, or kind of basic sort of kind of quote unquote good debt or more sustainable debt, you're borrowing a certain amount of money and then you're paying interest on that principal. It's like that initial balance. So that amortization schedule that I mentioned the bankers come up with, they're just like, great, over the next 30 years, you're every month going to make a payment. The payment is going to be exactly the same. It is going to pay down both principal and interest. In the beginning, you're paying a lot of interest and not paying down very much principal. Toward the end of that 30-year period, each payment is kind of reversed in terms of where the money is going. It's paying just a little bit of interest and a lot down in payment. And the reason that happens is because as you pay things down, there is less interest. You're just paying interest on that principal amount. And every month you're whittling down that balance. So each month your interest expense goes down a little bit. So we can really just think of that as like simple interest. Again, meaning you're just paying interest on that initial principal amount, the initial amount borrowed. The only time that compound interest really works to your disadvantage in the debt world is when you're not able to fully pay enough money for interest. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. That most commonly happens in the world of credit cards. So if you've got like $10,000 on a credit card, that might have a 26% interest rate. Like that's not unheard of. So like there's a huge amount of interest and you will have a minimum payment that the lender dictates you make. And in some cases, a lot of cases actually, that minimum payment is not going to fully pay for the interest that you've accrued during that month. So the balance actually grows. So you haven't earned interest, you've sort of been hit with some interest. And so at the beginning of the month, your balance was $10,000. let's say, just to keep things simple, over the course of the month, you were charged $1,000 in interest and you only paid $500, for example. Well, there's an additional $500 of interest that you were charged that you didn't pay off. So now that's part of the principal balance. And so now that's bad compounding. So that it is out there, but for student loans, for mortgages, compound interest really isn't a thing.
Yeah. And I was wondering that in the world of student loans, because the student loan landscape for Americans is fairly different than it is for Canadians. But something that
Okay.
I've heard
Yeah.
of for Americans that I'm curious what this is I have heard of folks where their loan payment is low enough that their student loan is actually growing, not shrinking.
Yes. Yeah.
What is at work there?
It's so complicated, man. The student loan landscape is so complicated. But yeah, so what's happening there is basically exactly what I was just
Yeah.
describing.
Okay.
In the US, there's something known as income-driven repayment plans, or IDR plans, which that is, an IDR is not an actual plan, it is a category of plan. So there are different types of IDR. So if you just say, I have an IDR, I'll be like, okay, well, which one? Like that doesn't
Okay.
necessarily mean anything. But at any rate, the idea is that we are not going to force you to pay back this student loan according to an amortization schedule like a mortgage. Instead, we're going to allow you to make a lower payment based on how much money you're making.
Mhm.
So in some cases, yes, the interest will be more
Mhm.
than the payment you're making. So the balance does grow, just like a credit card might grow
Yeah.
in the example I was using before. But the interest is simple.
Okay.
So you do not pay interest on
Okay.
the interest that's been accrued but not paid.
Right.
But there is an exception to that. When you consolidate your loan, or sometimes when you change the income-driven repayment plan that you are on, sometimes that interest will, what they call, capitalize.
Mm.
And once the unpaid interest capitalizes, then and only then does it become part of the principal balance that is dictating how much interest you're
Okay.
paying.
Right. So it can get turned
So
into
complicated.
principal if you consolidate
It
your debt
can,
and turn it into a
but
different type of debt.
that's right. But it won't.
Yeah.
So that's why when if you are on one of those plans and you see your balance growing, yes, I get that that's disheartening.
Mhm.
And Biden's new plan that's being challenged in the court would eliminate some of
Yes.
that.
Okay.
Actually, would eliminate all of it. We'll see if it happens.
Sure.
We'll see what happens.
Sure.
But even though your balance is growing, your interest burden actually isn't getting bigger. So it's not as bad as it might seem.
Okay. Okay. That's helpful to hear, because I think, like, it's helpful to hear that although it's growing, it is different than that credit card rate growing.
It is. That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
right.
it looks the same,
Yep.
but there's different things at play. And I think that's where folks
Yep.
being able to have conversations with people like yourself who speak policy and bureaucracy, because these things, they don't make them transparent. And I would say to some extent, they're not
No.
transparent on purpose, right? Like in complexity, there's a lot of things that can be hidden that makes it
Yes,
hard for
absolutely.
consumers to make good choices, or maybe
Yeah.
you just don't even have good choices you can make. You have to take what's available.
That's true. Yeah.
Um,
Sometimes that is the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah. But I think that's where, if for folks who have debt, taking some time to understand, what is your debt and how does it work? Is it simple? Is it compound? Your student loan is growing, but what does that actually mean financially?
Maybe that's not the worst.
Can
Yeah.
help you make those balanced decisions we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, complexity is a great point. Like, complexity is typically not your friend. There are a lot of financial products and investments out there that are so confusing and that is just generally, in the complexity, there's almost always something hidden.
Yes.
The student loan world, I think there's a lot of kind of like governmental reasons for that. I mean, it's just a mess. We'll see what happens. But you reminded me of something just in general. Like, when anyone is working with a financial professional or considering working with a financial professional, I always encourage you to ask two sort of interrelated questions. Number one is, how do I pay you, and how much? Like, how much are you going to charge me? And then you'll get a piece of information. That's an important question to ask. But the second question is maybe a more important one. And that is, tell me all the other ways you will earn money on our relationship.
Yes.
So that will help you understand, what commissions are they going to get? What conflicts of interest do they have in terms of the advice that they're offering you? And that's a really, really important piece to understand, because anytime a service is offered for a very low price or something feels too good to be true, you know what happens when things are
Yes.
seemingly too good to be
Absolutely.
true.
Yes.
They almost always are.
Absolutely. I saw an email from Julie Harris, colleague of both of us, last week,
Yeah.
where she used the example of her friend's toddler as a good reminder to all of us
Yeah, I
to
saw
always ask
that.
why. I thought that was
Yes.
such a sweet phrasing.
Yes, that's
She's just
so
like,
great. That was
why?
great.
Just keep asking your questions. Like,
Yep.
how do you get paid? And are there other ways you get paid? And like, just really letting yourself ask every and all questions of financial professionals, because something that can happen, and I recorded a feelings and finances like short answer episode recently about this, is like we can really sometimes fall back into this teacher student kind of relationship, or like where there's like an authoritarian
Yes.
relationship where we're
Yes, yes,
afraid to ask
yes.
questions, we don't want to look dumb.
Yes.
We're like, okay, they seem to know what
Yes.
they're doing, they have a nice desk, so clearly they've, figured things out in life. But really remembering that like you are the consumer, like you are the customer, and you get to ask questions. And if you don't like the answers to those questions, or if you don't like the fact that they're not answering your questions and you're getting a feeling,
Right.
I don't know if I really trust this person, you can walk, right? Like you are actually the person who
Yeah.
holds the power in that relationship.
Yeah. And also, like, this is, I think it's important to recognize, and I think everyone can fall victim to this in different areas of life. But when you get an answer that doesn't make sense to you, that is not your fault. To the extent there is fault, it's the person who's trying to communicate to you is not meeting your needs in terms of how they are communicating that piece of information. And that ambiguous communication might be an intentional strategy on the part of the salesperson. So it is okay just to be like, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yes,
You're going to have to explain it to
totally.
me again. And like,
Well, and for all the generalizations I would make about therapists, one I would never make is that therapists are dumb. Therapists are not dumb people.
absolutely. That's right.
Like,
That's right.
we're super
Absolutely.
bright people who tend to be able to be very perceptive and pull together complex informations in fractions of seconds to be able to do the work that we do. So if somebody's communicating and it's feeling unclear, you are a professional communicator. Something is wrong.
That's a great point.
Right. So like
Yeah.
trust your own skills and
Yep.
instincts and your
Yep.
gut
Yep.
more than what somebody is telling you if it doesn't feel right. So
Yeah.
David, thank you. I so appreciate you
Absolutely.
coming back on the podcast today. I so appreciate you having this conversation with me. For folks who are interested in hearing more about you and what you do, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I am a financial planner for therapists. So my mission in life is helping therapists understand the external financial world while sort of honoring their internal experiences around it, and just putting in place solid, smart financial plans that allow you to realize your goals in life. And if you want to learn more about me or just see a ton of free resources that I put together, visit my website. That website is turningpointhq.com. So that's the name of my firm, Turning Point. So it's Turning Point HQ, like the abbreviation for headquarters.com.
Love that. Thanks, David.
Absolutely. Thank you.
One of the key points that I'm certainly taking away from this conversation today is perhaps an affirmation that I received from Dave that often the middle road is the right road to walk when it comes to balancing your financial goals and your own well-being. So for folks who are listening, if you have debt and you're feeling really driven to pay down that debt, take some time to do the math and think about what would be the actual financial benefit of paying down that debt faster, especially if it's simple debt, right? If it's not debt that's going to be growing, if you're not having to pay interest on interest, as Dave talked about, what is the actual number, the financial benefit of paying down that debt faster compared to putting money in your investments where it's compounding, right? Where you're earning interest on interest and that money is growing. I certainly in my own life have made the decision that I like to have my foot in a little bit of both. That's very much my personality, very much my style. But also, it is actually more strategic, certainly in my case, to be putting money in my investments and know that I'm getting that compound interest, and knowing, 20 years from now when I retire, that money is going to grow much, much more than the positive impact I would get from paying down debt. So taking the time to really understand your numbers, think about your own needs and your emotional needs and the actual numbers, and decide how you want to balance these things in your own life. You are giving yourself such a gift of clarity when you take time to really understand your numbers and interrogate some of your stories, right? Like, don't make decisions simply to try to decrease your anxiety or shift out of a story that you're bad or that you're failing, but interrogate those stories. Don't let those stories run you alongside making informed financial decisions that have to do with real numbers. It is a huge gift to yourself, and especially to your future self, who, will be living off the money that you put aside now in the future, for you to really take time and be with these things. So I really appreciated Dave's perspective on this today. If you are enjoying the podcast, you can follow me on Instagram at Money Nuts and Bolts. And if you're interested in working with me and getting my support in a community of lovely, supported, as I mentioned, smart therapists who are also working on building a better relationship with their money and developing calm and clarity around their private practice business finances, you can check out my masterclass. You can think about that as my intake for the course. It's your chance to learn about my approach, learn about how I teach, learn about everything in the course. And it's also your invitation to join us in Money Skills for Therapists, which is my foundational course where we do all this work with folks. So if you are interested in working with me, you can click on the link in the show notes to check out my masterclass and learn more about how to develop calm and confidence with your money and learn more about my course, Money Skills for Therapists. Thank you so much for joining me this season. It's been another great season of the podcast, and we will see you next season. Thanks for joining me today.